Welcome to part 2 on how to control FMOD buses in Unity. Now, picking up right from where we left off in the last one, we'll be learning some new lines of code from FMOD's API that will allow us to hook up our buses, variables that can be adjusted during our game. We'll also be looking at how we can give the player of our game control over the audio levels from the game's audio settings menu. So to recap, where we left off last time, we created two new buses in FMOD, one for music and one for sound effects. We then created a new script with a bus variable and a public string. We also used the getBus command to start a bus path and combined that path with our string variable. We then used that public string to find 3 different bus paths for the 3 slider objects that have our script attached as a component. We're now ready to connect the slider components itself to the levels of our FMOD buses. Now to do that, we're going to need to create our own function. And it's in this function that we'll set the volume of our bus faders to match whatever value our slider is at. Now normally we start our functions with the word void, but because we want this function to be accessed by another component, say the slider component we looked at in the last lesson, we want to make sure we also make it public. Then we'll write void and we'll give it a name, such as volume level. Then inside its parameter brackets, we're going to create a new float variable and we're going to call it slider value. Finally, we'll give our function a body. Now the plan is for us to call this function whenever the player adjusts one of the sliders, and when they do, adjust the volume level of the appropriate bus respectively. So inside this function, we're going to write the name of our bus variable, which we know was bus, and then using the dot operator, we're going to use the command set volume and give it 2 parameter brackets and a semicolon. Now set volume we looked at ever so slightly in the FMOD namespaces lesson, and it's a command we can actually use with both bus variables and event instance variables. It takes float data that we put into the brackets and adjusts the level of our fader to an appropriate level based on the value we give it. Now because the levels of our faders are measured in decibels, which is a logarithmic scale and not a linear one, FMOD's API interprets float values based around the values of 1 and 0. So if we tell it to set the fader of one of our buses to 1, the fader on our bus will be set to whatever level it was when we built our banks in FMOD. If you haven't already, by the way, in order for our buses to be found by Unity, just like with our events, we need to make sure we build our banks that they are contained in. All of our buses, by the way, will be assigned to the master bank every time. We don't need to tell them to be assigned to a specific bank. So going back to the set volume command, because our faders are all at 0 decibels when we built those banks, our float value of 1 will equal 0 dB. And a float value of 0 or less would equal to minus infinity dB. Now, if, for example, I adjusted our faders to about minus 10 dB and were to then rebuild the banks, a float value of 1 would then equal minus 10 dB, but a float value of 0 or less would still equal minus infinity dB. Any value in between 1 and 0 would then set the faders based on where the fader started and minus infinity. So for example, if we were to set our music fader to about 0.5 in our script, our fader in FMOD would be set about halfway between minus 10 and minus infinity dB, which works out at about minus 28 dB. Now this is important to note as we communicate float values from our Unity sliders to decibels on our faders. So in our script, instead of feeding our command raw float data, we're instead going to feed it the float variable we created in our parameter brackets. So let's write slider value. Now, once we hook this function up to our slider components, which will call this function when the slider is adjusted by the player, a float value will be sent into this variable here and then into our command, setting a new position for our faders in FMOD. Awesome, so now it's time after we give our script a quick save to look at how our slider is going to call this function in Unity. So now that we're back in Unity, let's select the master volume slider object. Make sure you're selecting it on the menu canvas objects prefab, which we looked at in the last lesson, and then take a look at its attached slider component. As I mentioned in the first part of this lesson, this grey box here is called a Unity event. Now, Unity events are very powerful tools we can use inside the Inspector tab, and they're not restricted to just Unity components such as the slider either. We can declare our own Unity events in the scripts that we write, which will then appear in the Inspector tab when we use the script as a component. For this lesson, however, we'll just be focusing on interacting with them through the Inspector tab. Now, they allow us to trigger multiple public functions we've declared inside of other scripts that we've attached to any of the game objects in this scene we're currently editing. All of the functions get triggered together whenever the Unity event is triggered, which could be by another function or a condition that's being checked for example, an if statement. It depends on how the script was written. This one, for example, is called onValueChanged. So we can assume that whenever the value variable above it is changed, the Unity event and any functions from other scripts that we give it will all be triggered. So let's now take a look at how we can use this Unity event to trigger our volume level function from inside our bus control script. So if we click on the little plus icon here in the bottom right corner, we can add a new function to call. Now all we need to do is find the function, and we do that by giving this component the game object and script attached to the object that holds the function we want to call. Now in our case, the function is inside the f_bus control script, which is attached as a component to the master volume slider game object. So we'll start by dragging the object from the hierarchy tab into the onValueChanged box under where it says none object. Then we need to find the script that holds our function, which we know is the f_bus control script, and then choose the function we're after, which is our volume level function. Now you'll notice amongst all of the other options we can call, our function has actually appeared twice. Once under dynamic float and another under static parameters. Now if we select the one under static parameters, we get a final option to enter the value we would like to set our float variable, which is inside of our function, whenever this slider changes value. Now instead, we want the float variable in our function to match whatever value the slider is at when it changes. So let's go back and select our function under dynamic float. Finally, we have a box that says runtime only. It's here where you can decide when you want the slider to call your function, either during runtime of the game, both runtime and whilst Unity's editor is open, or never, but we just want to leave this as on runtime only. Once you've done that, you want to do the exact same thing for the other two slider objects. So for example, with the music volume slider, you're going to want to click the plus button on the slider component, drag over the object itself, and then find the function in the f_bus control script. Cool, so I've just finished doing that to all of my slider objects off screen. One final thing we want to quickly check before we test this is that the changes have been made to the objects that have already been loaded into this scene. So each of the slider objects themselves. So let's quickly leave this prefab. Let's select the master volume slider, for example, scroll down, and we can see the changes have been made. Let's also quickly double check the music volume slider. Yep, and the sound effects volume slider. Great, cool, so we're ready to play our game and give it a test. So now we're inside the game, we can pause it to open up our audio settings menu. But before we do that, let's quickly go through the menu canvas child objects and select the master volume slider object. Let's then make sure we've scrolled down the inspector tab so that we can see the slider component. And watch what the value of the slider does as we open up our menu and adjust it. So now in our game window, let's open up our options menu and select audio. So now if you've not changed the value of the slider in the inspector tab, it should be on 0.9. And so should all of your sliders in your game. So now if we adjust the master volume slider in the game, we can hear the volume of our music in the background drop, and notice also that the slider in the inspector tab also drops. Now if we then drop the music slider all the way down, and then return to our game, all we can hear is the sound effects. If we then go back to our menu and raise the music volume, but drop the sound effects volume, all we can hear is the music. So far it sounds pretty good, right? Everything seems to be working quite nicely. But what would happen if we entered another scene through our teleporter? So here we are in the next level of our game, and we can hear the music we added to it at the beginning of the last lesson. If we open up our audio settings menu, we can see that all of our sliders have returned to their original positions of 0.9. Now if we then click on level 2 in the hierarchy tab, go to system, menu canvas, and find one of our sliders, and then take a look at the slider component itself attached to it, we can see that it's also been set to 0.9. What's happening here is when we load the next scene, it's loading in a fresh copy of the menu canvas prefab, which as we know has the value of the sliders all set to 0.9, so no matter what value we leave them in at the end of one scene, all of our buses in FMOD will then be set back to 0.9 once we enter a new scene and then prefab loads. So obviously we want the sliders to remain set to what they were in between scenes. So to fix this, let's stop playing the game and look at how we can fix this in our script. Okay, so in order to start a new scene with our sliders in their new positions, we're going to need to tell them what those positions are before the scene starts. Now, unlike our sliders, the level of our FMOD buses will actually stay the same in between scenes. It wasn't until the prefab loaded into the second scene that our faders were told to return to 0.9 instead of remaining where they were. So all we need to do once a new scene has loaded in and our prefabs have loaded in with them is tell the UI sliders to match our FMOD faders before the faders are told to match the sliders. First, we need a way of retrieving the level of our bus faders and storing them inside of a float variable. So inside of our start function, underneath where we got our bus paths, we'll write bus.getVolume with 2 brackets and a semicolon. So this is a new command called getVolume, which can be used on both buses and event instance variables, just like the setVolume command. Now it takes whatever level your bus or event volume fader is at and outputs that level into 2 different float variables in C# for you to use in your scripts. One gives you the volume and the other gives you the final volume, something we'll talk a little bit more about soon. So because this command takes 2 arguments, let's quickly create those 2 float variables. We'll write private float and call it bus volume, and underneath we'll write private float and call it final bus volume. Then inside our command, we'll output the level of our bus fader to those 2 variables. First, the command wants a variable to output the volume of the bus fader to. So in the brackets, we'll write out space bus volume. Next, the component wants a variable to output the final volume of the bus to. So in the brackets, we'll separate the variables with a comma and write out final bus volume. So let's quickly take a moment to understand the difference between these 2 outputs we're getting from this command and why we can't just use one. Now, neither of these variables will actually give us the value of our faders. Instead, they will get whatever value those faders were told to be set to. The first output to our bus volume variable, simply known as the volume by the FMOD documentation, will only tell us what value our fader was last set to by the FMOD Studio API. In other words, whatever value we last set it to, if we did at all, using the setVolume command will be outputted to the volume variable as a float. The second output to our final bus volume variable, known as final volume by the FMOD documentation, will tell us what the value of our fader was set to last by both the FMOD Studio API, which is what we write in our code, and our FMOD project itself combined. Now by FMOD itself, I'm referring to the combination of volume modulation and automation set by parameters inside our actual FMOD project. So in other words, whatever the value of a fader was last set to, whether that was from the setVolume command we write, or a modulator or parameter from FMOD telling the fader to change, will be outputted to the final bus volume variable as a float. Now, in our case, we'll only be interested in the bus volume variable, as we're not changing the fader of our buses in FMOD using any modulation or parameters. So what we'll do, just as our scene starts on the first frame, is get the volume of our buses, output them into the bus volume variable, and then use that to set the value of our slider. And to do that, we need to reference the slider component on each game object. Now, as we've already learned, whenever we want to reference a component, we create a reference variable for the main class of the component we want, and then write getComponent in a function which will retrieve an instance of that component that's attached to the same object as our script is. And because we have this script attached to 3 different objects at once, each instance of our script will get the instance of the slider component that inhabits the same object. So for example, the script attached to the music volume slider object will get the instance of the slider component also attached to that game object. So in our class, let's write private, use the reference type slider, and we'll just call this variable slider for simplicity. Then in the start function, we're going to write slider equals getComponent slider. Now notice how both uses of the slider reference type are marked red with an error line, telling us that Unity doesn't recognize the slider class. Now, this is because the slider component is a UI element, and in Unity, we need to add the correct namespace to our script to reference UI-based components. Remembering back to our namespace lesson where we learned that some classes are created inside namespaces, well, the slider class was created in the UI namespace. So at the very top of our script, we're going to write using Unity engine.ui. Now those red error marks will disappear and the slider class will be highlighted green. Now the last thing we need to do is assess the value of our slider and set it to our bus volume variable. Now to do this, we simply write the name of our reference variable, which was slider, followed by the dot operator, and the name of the variable we'd like to access from it, which is value. Then we want to set the value of the value variable to match the value of our bus volume variable, which will hold the level of each bus in FMOD as a float value. So let's quickly remind ourselves how our new script will retain our slider values through different scenes. So the first time our game starts, on the very first frame, we'll get the level that our volume faders of our buses in FMOD are at, and output that into the bus volume variable. So whatever value you leave your buses on when you last built your bank, for mine it's 0 dB, that will be translated as a 1 into this variable. Next, after retrieving an instance of the slider component that shares an object with this script, the value of the slider is changed from whatever its value was in its prefab, say for example 0.9, to match our bus volume variable, which we know is set to 1. Quick side note, by the way, if you don't want your slider to start at the max value of 1, just increase the max value variable that the slider value can have, say for example to 2, but I'm going to leave mine as 1. Then the game starts fully and our player starts running around the level and decides to change the slider of one of our buses. This will then trigger the volume level function, which will take whatever value the slider has been set to and change our bus to match that value. Let's say for example they change the master volume slider from 1 to about 0.5. Then the player enters a new scene, which means the menu objects and the slider objects have been destroyed and reloaded in through the prefab, which was set to 0.9. So they're now back at 0.9. Then our player opens up the audio settings menu for the first time in this scene, which activates the object and means that our script will now run our start function again. This means that once the master bus has been found for the master volume slider, our script will then use the get volume command again, which will retrieve the value of the FMOD's master bus fader and store it inside the bus volume, which we know was left at 0.5, so the fader will be about halfway down at around -20. It will then get the slider component and set its value to match the bus's value. Awesome, so hopefully that made sense to you. Now we're going to quickly save our script, double check that in FMOD our buses are all set to the correct values, and build our banks one more time. Jump into our game and test our sliders out. So once the game's running, let's open up our audio settings menu and let's just mess around with our sliders. So we'll set the master volume to about, say, there. Music will bring all the way down or most of the way down. The sound effects will leave about halfway. So let's close our menu, run through the teleporter, and we'll load ourselves into scene 2. Now hopefully when we open up this menu in the next scene, the sliders will be in the same place as we just left them. So we can already hear the music is already quite low, so let's open up the settings menu. We can see our sliders are in the exact same position that we left them in. Awesome, so after a very long two-parted lesson, we've learned a lot about FMOD buses in Unity. We've learned how to set the volume of buses and events with set volume. We've learned how to retrieve the last value they were set to, as well as using get volume. We also looked at how to call a function when a slider component changes value, and how FMOD translates decibels into float variables. We're not quite done with our audio settings menu yet, however, as in the next lesson we'll be utilising what's known as playback states to make a small but quite important improvement to it. However, for now, that was quite a lot to take in, so once you felt like you've gotten everything you can from this lesson, maybe go back over it a couple of times and mess around with the sliders and the scripts. I'll see you in the next one.